In 1913, two young boys had run away from Emporia. They somehow found the means to journey over 100 miles to the Paris of the Plains, the bustling metropolis of Kansas City, Missouri. When a sympathetic officer of the KCPD asked the adventuresome duo why they had left Emporia, one replied, "Well, there's nothing there but William Allen White, and we got tired of hearing of him."
As a native Kansan, I was always very proud of William Allen White. And every time everybody mentioned the name William Allen White, I would go, hey, he's one of us. And us meaning somebody from Kansas, and look at this man who had made such an imprint.
What William Allen White did was basically affect the national political conversation by invoking the small town values of Emporia, Kansas. And he was doing this in a period of fairly traumatic political change in the country, and he gave voice to a kind of progressive republicanism that understood the Republican Party's values, but also spoke out against some of its darker impulses and some of the darker impulses of populism, and particularly on race relations.
What I liked about him is he reminds me of Mark Twain with the way he uses language, but his sense of humor and the satire.
William Allen White was a principled man, a thoughtful man, felt that, I'm not going to be in the room anymore. I don't even know what room I'm going to be in. Maybe it's going to be a very small room back in Emporia, Kansas, but I'm going to continue to think about the country in the same way. I'm going to continue to urge people to be active in the same way. I'm going to call out what I see are harms that could befall this nation. And that is extraordinarily courageous. It is extraordinarily principled, and I think it's one of the things that I will always admire about White. He didn't gravitate to stay in the powerful circle. He said, I don't like this direction, and I'm going to call it out, and even if it means I never get invited to the party again, even there's no seat for me at the table, that's okay.
William Allen White was an idealist. Yet his style of idealism was a contradiction. He was sophisticated and urbane.
And now we move down 45th Street to the Music Box Theater to catch the glamorous opening night of Ceiling Zero. Near the head of the line, in the gray outfit, is Walter Winchell, famous Broadway columnist. And here's Gary Cooper. What's the matter, Gary? A little camera shy? Here's William Allen White, eminent journalist.
I'm mighty glad to congratulate Brock Pemberton on another success.
Yet, he was a rural figure, provincial and down home. He remained a Kansan his entire life. He was a journalist, politician, novelist, diplomat, activist, humanitarian, but always a small-town newspaperman. He could be a rock-hard deal-maker, driving forward agreements in the best tradition of grassroots activism. Yet he refused to give in to the harmful elements of machine politics. He received 10 honorary degrees, including one from Harvard, and advocated education his entire life.
Since I first came to the University of Kansas 50 years ago and went out after 4 years without a degree, I've often asked myself, what is the thing we call an education, and I don't know.
Yet he himself did not graduate from college, accomplishing most of his learning from his editor's desk, world travel, and from relationships with some of the great leaders and thinkers of the time. Forever modest, he was confident of his abilities as a journalist, but used his editorials not only to explore global issues and national politics, but also to defend Main Street and ensure its success. This would make him the voice of small-town America, and he would develop that community into a metaphor that would help the country understand their plight. He would become the Sage of Emporia, one of the foremost journalists of his time. But White's appearance on the world stage would occur when America needed a voice from the heartland, a moderate voice, grounded in community, justice, and democratic ideals, a voice for an expanding nation, ready for change. America needed a William Allen White. The world of the 1890s was a time of vast change. America was witnessing the last vestiges of the Old West. Sitting Bull was murdered at the Standing Rock Reservation. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were on their last robbery spree. The Dalton Gang was gunned down during a failed bank robbery in downtown Coffeyville, Kansas. James Naismith, the inventor of the game of basketball, becomes the first coach at Kansas University. Things were moving from the agricultural to the industrial, from the country to the city. It was the Gilded Age, a time of rapid industrial growth and an influx of immigrant labor. The lack of government regulation created opulence for the rich, while it literally wiped out the poor. The late 1880s and early 90s were a tough time for Kansas farmers. Drought and debt were destroying everything. Crops failed and farmers were losing their livelihood to foreclosure. In response, a new radical idea swept across Kansas like a prairie fire. It was called the People's Party.
The populists of the 1890s and the People's Party were very progressive. They were thinking about the future, and they had a remarkable set of policies that came out of the Omaha platform and other places that are things we know about in the modern world today: direct election of senators, public ownership of utilities and railroads.
It was a party that embraced people rather than corporations, what was good for communities, what was good for families, what was a living wage, what was decent treatment of labor. And some populists went as far as to embrace crazy things like equality of women and equality of the races. I mean,
the world of the Kansas farmer was being turned upside down. I mean, it was like a revolution, like we're seeing today. And they were undergoing globalization. The crops in Kansas were a part of it. It was an international market. They were having to spend more and more money on new technologies. You needed a McCormick harvester. They were deeper and deeper in debt. That was the thing that sort of drove populism and the People's Party in Kansas. And the Kansas People's Party was ground zero of the populist movement.
In 1892, they elect a governor and to control the legislature. You have all kinds of turmoil as a result of this conflict between populists and Republicans in Kansas in particular.
One election, the guys are there with muskets keeping the other side out. There were beatings with ball bats that occurred on some occasions. And these are the elected representatives. These are not storming hordes coming into the Capitol. These are folks who actually were the office holders. So we have a rough and tumble, turbulent history.
Republicans and populists both claimed victory in the Kansas House elections in 1892. Causing violence to break out on the floor of the legislature. Republicans used a sledgehammer to bust through the door of the House of Representatives. To establish order, Governor Llewellyn surrounded the Capitol with over 200 militiamen, including Gatling guns. This forced the governor to negotiate.
And so White was watching the political foundation that he was so comfortable with being really, in his mind, undermined.
They drove William Allen White crazy. At the time, he was very conservative. He had studied at the University of Kansas, believed deeply in orthodox economics, what we would today call neoclassical economics. Later in life, when he looked back upon himself at that time, he described himself as a member of the state's ruling class. The politicians that the populists elected were often regarded as cranks, people from way outside the mainstream, people who were not wealthy, were not well educated, who had funny nicknames. There was one from Kansas called Sockless Jerry Simpson. It's a great man, by the way, and William Allen White later became friends with him. But at the time, White hated populism.
So one time he's walking to his office in Emporia, a young man in his mid-20s, full of himself, a little pudgy. He always talked about how pudgy he is.
We were walking through town in Emporia, and the populists would sort of harangue him because they were the majority, actually. We wanted to debate things with him, and it was a hot day that day in particular, so he was used to this days of being kind of harassed. Right? His wife, Sally, is already in Colorado for vacation. He wants to join her, and he's walking through town trying to just get stuff done before the afternoon train.
Populists were giving him a hard time about several of the things he had written before in the Gazette, and chastising him about his strong-held political beliefs, and actually taking a stick and kind of poking him in the stomach with it. It made White angry.
He's hot and kind of angry, and so he goes back to the office.
By the time he got to his office, he was red hot, and sat down and wrote out, "What's the matter with Kansas?"
Laura French, who later became his managing editor, was a typesetter, a young woman at that time, and she said later she set the type for it and just was seething, because she was sympathetic with the populists, and she was just furious. And so they kind of thought, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this, but then they went ahead and did it, and it just exploded.
That became picked up by other newspapers and ran during that 1896 election all across the United States.
Today, the Kansas Department of Agriculture sent out a statement which indicates that Kansas has gained less than 2,000 people in the past year.
People are leaving Kansas. It's the only state, he says, in the country where people are moving out of and not moving into.
No one brings any money into Kansas anymore. What community knows over 1 or 2 men who have moved in with more than $5,000 in the past 3 years? What's the matter with Kansas? We all know. Yet here we are at it again.
This was his complete put down to populism.
That's the stuff. Give the prosperous man the Dickens. Legislate the thriftless man into ease.
These people, the populists, and he made fun of them. By the way, he made fun of their nicknames, he made fun of their views, he made fun of the way they spoke, all of this stuff. These people are driving respectable business people from Kansas.
Whoop it up for the ragged trousers. Put the lazy, greasy fizzle who can't pay his debts on the altar and bow down and worship him. Let the state ideal be high. What we need is not the respect of our fellow men, but the chance to get something for nothing.
They're driving money out of the state. They're wrecking the state with their stupid ideology, their left-wing ideology, their left-wing views.
We have another shabby, wild-eyed, rattle-brained fanatic who has said openly in a dozen speeches that the rights of the user are paramount to the rights of the owner.
And he did it with this swagger.
What we need is not more money, but less capital, fewer white shirts and brains, fewer men with business judgment, and more of those fellows who boast that they are just ordinary clodhoppers.
He wrote his all-time greatest essay, and one of the greatest essays ever in the course of American journalism, What's the Matter with Kansas, which I both disagree with politically, but really admire for the style in which it's written.
It made an impact because of the way it was written. It's beautifully written. And there have been many offshoots of it since then, but it's considered a masterpiece of journalistic opinion writing.
It gets picked up in Kansas City and other places, and then somebody sees it, the banker in Chicago sees it and sends it to Mark Hanna, who was the Republican boss at the time and the manager of McKinley's campaign.
McKinley's campaign manager, Mark Hanna, sees it. He sees it as a perfect opportunity, I think, to link Bryan, the Democratic nominee, who had served in Congress and had a good reputation, but to link him with a more radical element that maybe would helped turn the tide against him.
And they distributed by the hundreds of thousands this editorial.
He came back like a week later to discover that the essay had been picked up by newspapers all over America, and he had become this sensation.
Well, he got all kinds of letters from people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere saying, you're giving them hell, that kind of stuff, right?
This is the great political campaign of 1896, basically one of the most divisive, huge turnout. Everybody is involved in this election. It's a huge deal. McKinley versus Bryan. Which side are you on? The country's dividing right down the middle.
Overnight, almost, he becomes a national figure and people become more and more interested.
What's important about the way White handled his own celebrity is really important, that he was a celebrity. He did have proximity to power. He had a voice that everybody listened to, but he didn't use that proximity to power to advance his own interests. He stayed in Emporia, Kansas. He continued to run the Emporia Gazette. He didn't move on to Washington, where I live now, or New York, or Paris, or any of those other places.
In 1896, at the age of 28, William Allen White had become nationally known. He was now a friend to presidents and an insider to the Republican Party.
There is a new kind of populism abroad in Kansas, and it's not a populism of the left, it's a populism of the right. Okay? It's a populism that wants exactly the same things that William Allen White wanted, free markets, get government out of, stop regulating, stop taxing, all these things. So exactly the opposite politics, but done with the same kind of populist imagery and populist narrative that you saw in the 1890s. White had an amazing transformation in life. Not amazing, it happens to many people. Their politics, as they age, their politics develop. And he changed sides politically. Now, he never stopped being a Republican. He remained loyal to the Republican Party right up to the end. But his politics moved way to the left. He wasn't alone in this, by the way. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a close friend of his, did the same thing. Roosevelt hated populism in 1896, of course, everybody did, all the Republicans did, but later in life really changed, and he became the great trust buster, and he had his own vision of this kind of, what to do about industrialization.
When he met Roosevelt, who was an, unquestionably charismatic person, he was immediately drawn. So when he says, "I was bit," it was a real melding moment for him.
When you rediscover Teddy Roosevelt and progressive republicanism, you don't have to reach very far to rediscover William Allen White in the same breath.
White saw this young man with so much vision and so much promise, and it was exciting for him, and they connected in that way.
Roosevelt really expressed different kinds of ideals about politics as being much more idealistic, more ennobling, and that was kind of a new idea for White. It took a long time before that really bore fruit in his becoming much more progressive in politics, but it planted the seeds. But because they had this relationship and they corresponded, frequently, it was something that developed, and Roosevelt was always guiding him here and there, and it really set him on the way.
Running for president was obviously something that Roosevelt had thought about on his own for a long time. And then when White meets him, and he's this, incredibly ambitious young man, very well educated, very knowledgeable about history and about science. And I think White saw in him a potential for a very intellectual president, but also a president that had a lot of energy that he could give to the still young country, and that made sense to White. I think that there's something about the Midwestern approach to life and thought, and it's just absolutely about being a decent human being, being honest, being trustworthy, working hard.
William Allen White, as much as he was a devotee of the Republican Party, was even more so a devotee of Teddy Roosevelt. And I think he would have followed Roosevelt off a bridge.
His father died when he was young, and he had a kind of series of attachments with older men, father figures in his life. He formed very strong attachments, and served very loyally the people that he had. I mean, that was part of the politics of the day. It was based on loyalty and reciprocity, not so much, high ideals.
And Teddy's politics and his progressivism are interesting. Teddy's politics were wherever the votes were and wherever it made Teddy the most popular. I mean, was he a big progressive? It kind of worked out that way. But Teddy was energy and he was juice. Follow me, boys. The Bull Moose Party was just the Rough Riders again.
Roosevelt seemed to him as a person who would rein in corporate abuses and power. Now, Roosevelt had a particular approach to it, as far as I'm concerned. He embraced the corporate structure, but he just said government is going to be there to regulate it for the common good. And White was okay with that. Roosevelt was becoming, to some degree, pretty radical in some of his statements, like his Osawatomie speech.
One of the most left-wing speeches ever given by an American president. He was a former president at the time, but he had gone way to the left, and he comes to Kansas to announce it, to announce his new political vision.
Where he talks about human dignity being more important than property.
And by the way, Barack Obama came to Kansas to sort of announce the same thing, that he was, to give his famous speech about inequality in America, came to Osawatomie.
The Republican Party failed to go with Roosevelt in 1912 and instead stayed with William Howard Taft, who ironically, of course, had been Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. White was disillusioned with the party to a certain extent at that point, so it was probably a big decision, but it was one that was made easier because he was so committed to what Roosevelt stood for.
Taft wasn't Roosevelt. That was his biggest problem, because and this was true of a lot of progressives who underrated what Taft was doing, and Roosevelt tended to do more, big splashy things that got a lot of press because that's how he knew how to do it.
Roosevelt says, okay, I'm running again, and I'm running on this progressive platform, which they called the Bull Moose Party, because when he was running, he was shot when he was giving a speech, and he continued to give the speech for an hour and a half with a bullet in his chest, and he said it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And so that's when it became, they started calling it the Bull Moose Party, and hardly anybody remembers now that it was called the Progressive Party.
The new party reflects White's evolving progressive views and opposes the growing conservatism of the Republican Party.
The party began to shift and move. I think he would have been one of the Republicans today who said, I didn't leave the party left me.
I think he had more of an influence from his family, perhaps from his mother, about what constituted a moral and just society, both socially and economically.
His mother went to Knox College, which was a center of abolitionism in the 1850s. And it was there that she saw a debate between Lincoln and Douglas.
It was the site of the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate. And his mother was there to hear those debates.
She absolutely fell in love with Lincoln. And so she was a rock-ribbed Republican, even though, of course, women didn't get to vote in those days. She adored him in the same way that her son would adore Teddy Roosevelt.
She was a strong, avid abolitionist, highly morally principled woman, and rather humorless, according to White. But I think she had a profound impact on his social attitudes.
Her husband was a Democrat, and he was involved in Democratic politics. So it was a mixed marriage, from the beginning. And it was always kind of a difficulty. And his parents seemed to have, it was sort of a rocky marriage, let's put it that way. So he always felt like, as the only child, that he was sort of trying to kind of bring together these opposites. But his father was the politician, his mother loved literature, and so as he grew up later, he was sort of trying to do both.
William Allen White had a vivid recollection of his mother reading to him as a child during long winter evenings. Night after night, he once wrote, I remember as a child sitting in the chair, looking up at her while she read Dickens and George Eliot, My father, I remember, used to growl a good deal at the performance, and it was to those nights of reading that I owe whatever I have of a love for good reading.
When Will was 14, his father died. At the time of his death, Alan White was mayor of El Dorado. So the funeral was attended by the whole town and people outside of the town. It would have made quite an impression on a young William Allen White to have that many people attending his father's funeral.
In the 1880s, he attends the University of Kansas, doesn't graduate. He's always pretty open about that he left before he graduated, but was very close to the University of Kansas all his life because of those fond memories that he had and friendships that he made.
One of the key mentors at the University of Kansas was Professor James Halm Canfield. It was Canfield, White said, who advised him to go into the Republican Party rather than as an independent or a hopelessly outnumbered Democrat.
He was a Republican, and he was a Republican for the post-Civil War reasons that had to do with equality and the idea that, you sort of move, good Republican citizens with their land and their farms and their small businesses across the country and populate it like that. Now, the Republicans of that day took a weird turn, but I don't think White ever did. I think that's the way I think he saw 1,000 Emporias lighting the landscape in the West.
He leaves to go to work for a couple different Kansas City papers, the Journal and then eventually the Kansas City Star.
So William Allen White cuts his teeth at the Kansas City Star under the tutelage of William Rockhill Nelson, at a time when there were really a lot of competition in the newspaper business.
Will White found working for the Star very stimulating. One day, he is introduced to a young woman named Sally Lindsay. And Sally Lindsay was a school teacher. White began to court her, and in 1893, they were married in the parlor of her parents' home in Kansas City. They were very intent on finding a college town, and they would like to buy their own newspaper.
White always kind of wanted to be his own boss and began looking for an opportunity and found it in the town of his birth in Emporia in 1895 when he was able to purchase the Gazette and settle in, as he wrote in his first kind of editorial. The young editor hoped to be the old editor.
He borrowed $3,000 to buy the Gazette, which was only 5 years old, and it had 2 owners.
And he acquired the newspaper in Emporia, the Gazette, that had formerly been run by the populists.
And then 14 months later, he wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, which threw him onto the national stage.
The Whites had 2 children, William Lindsay, born in 1900, and a daughter, Mary, born in 1904.
Mary White would have had a very unusual childhood in the Midwest. She was, like her brother, very well read, very intelligent, but unlike her brother, she was very outspoken, I think somewhat bossy.
When Mary visited the Gazette, White would ask her for a kiss, but she would always refuse. Mary was simply too strong and independent.
As she grew older, would even get in fights with boys. In high school, she saw the principal's office more often than a lot of students at Emporia High. I think her father enjoyed her. She had a sense of humor, like his. Besides reading, she enjoyed drawing, especially as she got older. A lot of her drawings are political in nature or humorous in nature. She likes to kind of poke fun at people a little bit. She kind of does in her drawings what her father did in his editorials. She loved reading, but most of all, she loved horseback riding.
She had her own car, like a jitney, a cab. Anybody who was around got a ride with her. She was a very kind of free-spirited but very idealistic young woman.
White's novel, In the Heart of a Fool, was adapted into a silent film in 1920. White and Mary attended a screening, but were disappointed with the film. He shared the experience in a letter to Sally.
Mary White sat by me during the ordeal and chuckled and giggled and made the funniest running comment you ever heard. For instance, "Father, why do you take their money? They haven't used your story. Mary was deliriously hilarious about it. She is a perfect dear. She knew I was plagued to death, and she cheered me up. The picture is a mess.
It is interesting to me, the relationship between press and politics. And William Allen White was a part of politics. He reported on it, but he was also involved. So from early in his career, he was going to Republican conventions. He was participating in those conventions. He had a say in them. He was maneuvering to write pieces for particular publications so he could get in the know. He had a lot to do with introducing Hoover as a candidate at that time. He had a lovely dinner for them. He had the editors from Kansas City bring Hoover down, so he had the powerful Kansas City editors as well. He had his friends from Topeka and all of the major newspapers. 50 editors in all were invited. And after dinner, the men go in and they talk, and Hoover just talks to them.
I think one of the things that's striking about his life is that he managed to make connections to national and international political figures without ever losing his own independence. And you know, there's a kind of a sense that if you get too close to people of power, you are basically being compromised. Well, I think he managed to be in the conversation with powerful people without compromising his values to those powerful people. And he showed that that's possible as well, and I think that's an important thing to remember. He knew them, they listened to him, but he kept his own values as he did that.
Hoover and William Allen White embraced a lot of the progressive thoughts of the day. Hoover and William Allen White appreciated one another.
White walked reluctantly and suspiciously into the New Deal.
However unfair it may be, the fact remains that Herbert Hoover for 4 years has been the scapegoat for the Depression.
Slowly but surely, gradually, White became sort of disillusioned with Herbert Hoover. White realized that Herbert Hoover just did not have the ability to inspire people, to get them to do what he thought should be done.
There is a disappointment that Hoover's not able to deliver. But who could have foreseen this happening? I don't think that brands the friendship as over for long. I mean, it's just a matter of getting through this.
When he went to Europe after the war as part of the Versailles conference and traveled around and talked to people, he discovered to his kind of surprise that the Americans had been much more hard on dissent, and there had been much more repression of disunity in the United States than there even had been in Europe. And it kind of made him rethink things a little bit. So you see him in the 20s emerging as an advocate of freedom of speech, of journalism as kind of standing apart from and maybe critiquing society, the government, in a way that he hadn't been earlier. So there is an evolution.
The Attorney General seems to be seeing red. He is rounding up every manner of radical in the country. Every man who hopes for a better world is in danger of deportation by the Attorney General. The whole business is un-American. The Attorney Generals of the United States, Palmer and Dougherty, led the crusade against the Reds, and that popular mind was inflamed. Terrible injustices were done at that time, social, political, economic, by the suspicious and credulity of disillusioned people that believed nothing and suspected everything. I am now satisfied that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent of the crimes for which they were executed. Their execution was a crime for which America lost prestige in the eyes of millions all over the world. Militarism is not crushed. It is stronger today than it was 10 years ago. The boys who were let out to slaughter, the boys who came back maimed and broken, the boys who lost their ideals and faith in humanity, all have suffered and is sacrificed in vain if the world is to remain at its present status.
You know, when it comes to the 20s and he gets involved in the issue of freedom of speech and writes the editorial to an anxious friend, you couldn't have a more perfect statement of the position of the importance of dissent and free engagement and that sort of thing.
Allen was a progressive. He had been a major follower, like White, of Theodore Roosevelt, and had also split with the Republican Party to join the Bull Moose Party of Roosevelt. So when the railroad workers went on strike in 1922, towards the end of his administration, he made that strike illegal, ordered the railroads to continue to operate, and basically said that anybody that was verbally or in print or whatever supporting the strike were violating an executive order.
Placards would say, we're in support of the strikers. And Governor Allen said, nope, anybody who does that, they're going to be arrested. And so White saw that as an infringement of freedom of speech.
And so White took exception with that and posted a sign in his newspaper office's window.
So long as the strikers maintain peace and use peaceful means in this community, the Gazette is for them, 50%, and every day which they refrain from violence, we shall add 1% more of approval.
And then he signed it, challenging, basically, his friend Allen, who's governor of the state, to come and arrest me.
Come on and arrest me, and we'll test this matter in the courts. I think your order restricts the liberty of utterance. Peace is good. But if you're interested in peace through force and without free discussion, that is to say, free utterance, decently and in order, your interest in justice is slight. And peace without justice is tyranny, no matter how you may sugarcoat it with expedience.
Not so much the strike as the principle was what was driving White. And he wrote one of his most famous and highly praised Pulitzer Prize winning editorials, To an Anxious Friend.
Think about how relevant William Allen White would be today, given this quote, peace without justice is tyranny. You know, if you're just requiring people to be silent and to just suffer peacefully, that's not justice. And apply that to the NFL players who are kneeling, who are supposed to sit idly by while young men in their communities, many of them are unarmed, are being shot and killed by police officers, and they're kneeling. It's not as though they're committing acts of violence or terror. They're simply kneeling. I mean, as protests go, it's really pretty passive, and yet people are so outraged.
This state today is more in danger from suppression than from violence because, in the end, suppression leads to violence. Violence, indeed, is the child of suppression. Whoever pleads for justice helps to keep the peace, and whoever tramples on the plea for justice, temperately made in the name of peace, only outrages peace and kills something fine in the heart of man, which God put there when he got our manhood. When that is killed, brute meets brute on each side of the line.
Bill attended Harvard, and Mary was studying hard to attend Wellesley. Mary had found a new interest in her studies. White wrote to Edna Ferber.
She is so rotten good that I'm always afraid that when she takes off her corset cover, her wings will sprout and she'll fly away.
Come on in here for a second. We can decide where to meet. Mary, come on. Mary.
Maybe they should put white only on the door.
Among her friends at Emporia High were some of the few black girls that attended that school. And it became apparent to her, she hadn't even thought about the fact, that these girls had nowhere to go between classes. This was something that Mary started working for, was a lounge that was dedicated to, as she called them, it was the language of the day, colored girls. And her father and mother made that happen. So on May 10th, 1921, when Mary had another accident with her horse, Will was away in the East on a book tour. And Sally sent him a telegram saying Mary has had another one of her accidents and he didn't need to return home. And then she talked about the house, because the house was being remodeled at that time, and that the house is looking grand, everything's going well. Well, within a few hours, that changed. And then there became a series of telegrams, each one more dire.
White took a train and rushed home to Emporia. While changing trains in Chicago, White was surprised to be met by his friends, Harold Ickes and Edna Ferber. They told him that Mary had died.
The great tragedy of William Allen White's life and of Sally White's life was that she died too young, and she was a horse rider, and people talked about, who visited Emporia would see this girl, riding through the streets on a horse, and later on would find out that was Mary White.
The Associated Press reports, carrying the news of Mary White's death, declared that it came as the result of a fall from a horse. How she would have hooted at that. She never fell from a horse in her life. Horses have fallen on her and with her. I'm always trying to hold him in my lap, she used to say. She was proud of a few things, and one of them was that she could ride anything that had 4 legs and hair.
And about how she liked to drive, and that she was picking up people and driving them around, and just how proud he was of her as a free spirit.
For she used the car as a jitney bus. It was her social life. She never had a party in all her nearly 17 years, wouldn't have one. But she never drove a block in her life that she didn't begin to fill the car with pickups. Everybody rode with Mary White. White and black, old and young. She liked nothing better than to fill the car with long-legged high school boys and an occasional girl and parade downtown. She never had a date, nor went to a dance except once with her brother Bill, and the boy proposition didn't interest her, yet. But young people, great spring-breaking, varnish-cracking, fender-bending, door-sagging carloads of kids gave her great pleasure.
The whole town was devastated. But after the funeral, White went to the Emporia office and wrote what he always did for citizens of all kinds in Emporia. That was his job, was to write their obituary. And he said, people expected him to. He wanted to do this. And how he did it so soon after the funeral, I still don't understand. But he wrote, I can't even talk about it without crying. He wrote something that was so powerful and so beautiful as a tribute to her and as a tribute to a certain kind of young womanhood that she embodied for him, of a kind of purity and sassiness and caring and just so full of life and embracing everything in her community, that it was immediately recognized as a classic.
Her humor was a continual bubble of joy. She seemed to think in hyperbole and metaphor. She was mischievous without malice, as full of faults as an old shoe. No angel was Mary White, but an easy girl to live with, for she never nursed a grouch 5 minutes in her life.
I could just feel his restraint. I could just feel his heartbreak. The understatement is so powerful in that piece. That's why it's so moving.
This is a teenager in a high school. My goodness, think about deaths in high school today. And whole schools rally around and have memorial services and grief counselors. So I think what he did would absolutely happen today, and that same kind of reaction would be positively received in a community.
He was so direct and so unornamented in his writing and so unsentimental about the thing he should have been most sentimental about. And I was always impressed that you can sort of feel the emotion without letting it overwhelm what you have to say.
A rift in the clouds in a gray day threw a shaft of sunlight upon her coffin as her nervous, energetic little body sank to its last sleep. But the soul of her, the glowing, gorgeous, fervent soul of her, surely was flaming in eager joy upon some other dawn.
It broke their hearts. I don't think really in a real sense they ever really recovered from that. It was devastating.
In some ways, William Allen White had a career that blossomed after the death of Mary. And I think part of it was that was how he could best, he wrote the editorial, he put her to bed, and then he went on with his life. But I do think his run for governor was very much informed by Mary. What would Mary want me to do?
Throughout the history of this country, and particularly starting in about the 1840s after the earliest waves of immigration started, there's always been the backlash. The other is taking our jobs. The other is not American. The other is not a part of white civilization, which was all the rage in those days. Get these people out of here. And it always takes a very populist cast.
The 1920s was a time of these weird culture wars. One of them was Prohibition, by the way, which is huge in Kansas, and another was the Klan, which had this enormous revival after World War I, largely thanks to a stupid movie that everybody had seen, where the Klan were the heroes in the movie. The Klan represented a kind of really blunt, ugly, stupid pseudo-patriotism.
White became concerned about the growing influence of the Klan on both major parties. It was not only a reaction to the traditional Klan hatred of African Americans, but was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. And these, of course, were groups that were identified with new immigrants, with radicalism, Bolshevism, all of these things that were coming out of the First World War.
In the spring of 1921, 200 Kleagles, recruiters for the Ku Klux Klan, descended on Kansas with the mission to make this state a stronghold for the hate group. In little time, 40,000 Kansans were enrolled in the Invisible Empire.
If you go back and you look at how they operated in Wichita, in the Ark City area, Winfield, Coffeyville, they were almost like a chamber of commerce, almost like the Kiwanis Club. You know, when you drive in a lot of small towns and they have these little signs, the Lions Club, the Kiwanis Club, it was like the Klan as well. At one point, the Klan numbered about 6,000 in Wichita. So it was just like maybe one of your largest civic organizations in town.
It was expensive to join the Klan. It cost about $21 to join the Klan. Today, that'd be $300-something. You had to pay dues, you had to buy the equipment. It was an expensive prospect. And the guy that sold you the membership, you might say, made money off of it. And so did the guys who ran the Klan. So it was a big money-making organization.
White returned from a European trip to find his beloved Emporia had literally been invaded by the KKK.
Klansmen ran the police department, Klansmen ran the city council, and the mayor was the Klansman. So Emporia was basically taken over.
The first thing the Klan does when it organizes is to try to bribe some preacher by pompously marching up the aisle of his church in their silly nightgowns and giving him $25, a little less than 20 cents apiece for each Klansman. No Emporia preacher should accept a bribe. In Kansas City, preachers threw back the money when it was presented. The thing to do is to take it and give it to the colored churches or the Knights of Columbus. That would show the Klan about what honest people thought of its cowardly propaganda.
The Klan was having a convention in Emporia and wanted to have a parade. And Dad would not issue the parade permit as long as they were wearing their masks and regalia. So they took an appeal to district court. And the judge, I.T. Richardson, was a Klansman, overruled Dad, and the Klan had their parade.
They marched 4 abreast from 5th Street to 12th Street. That's how many there was of them.
Bert Rich, an African-American, longtime resident of Emporia, spoke about his memories of White in 1974.
They didn't scare me. People told the Ku Klux that I was a contractor for hire here. One evening they came out to my place. There was 4 of them. They asked if I wanted to contract the grade work on the bridge on the Neosho River. I said, I don't know. I have to go see the bridge. One said, well, why don't you get in and we'll go look at the bridge? I said, sure. I'll go get my coat. I'll be right back. I went in the house, then went back outside holding my 245s and said, let's go. One of them said, oh, I forgot. We have a meeting in town to go to. We can now. I never heard any more from them.
In 1924, the governor was up for re-election. It was an important election because the preceding governor, who was White's friend, Henry Allen, had started criminal proceedings against the Klan. There's a law in Kansas that you have to get a state charter. You can't run a sort of in-state corporation without the state charter. So he filed charges for breaking that law.
Attorney General Charles Griffith wanted an anti-Klan plank in the platform of the Kansas Republican Party, but was overruled by Ben S. Paulin, who was backed by the KKK and was the Republican nominee for governor. The Democrats also backed the Klan. Governor Jonathan M. Davis was elected with Klan support in 1922.
Both parties generally, White believed, were refusing to take on the Klan and the issues that he felt were of concern.
This crossed a line for White. He realized the KKK was taking over city and state governments. Indiana and the South were already Klan-controlled. Kansas was next in line.
He decided to run in 1924 as the write-in candidate for the governorship to make sure that Kansas never became Klansas. That's how he put it.
The issue in Kansas this year is the Ku Klux Klan above everything. The Ku Klux Klan is found in every county. It represents a small minority of the citizenship and is organized for the purpose of terror. Its terror is directed at honest, law-abiding citizens, Negroes, Jews, and Catholics. These groups in Kansas comprise more than 1/4 of our population. They're entitled to their full constitutional rights, their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, because of their skin, their race, or their creed, the Ku Klux Klan in Kansas is subjecting them to economic boycott, to social ostracism, to every form of harassment, annoyance, and every terror that a bigoted minority can use. Kansas, with her intelligence and pure American blood, of all states, should be free of this taint. I was born in Kansas and lived my life in Kansas. I'm proud of my state. And the thought that Kansas should be a government beholden to this hooded gang of mass fanatics, ignorant and tyrannical in their ruthless oppression, is what calls me out of the pleasant ways of my life and into this disgraceful but necessary task.
He had taken a lifelong sort of vow against running for office himself. He felt that this sort of undermined his status as a journalist because you could always say, well, you're trying to grind your own axe.
And he didn't even declare until September. And so he ran for like 3 months. His son drove him all over Kansas. He gave speeches. And then the night of the election, he went to bed happy, knowing he would probably lose. But he did make a statement.
Reverend William Woodward, the Georgia-based spokesman for the KKK, was concerned about White's candidacy. If White, Ryan, and Griffith are successful in November, the Kansas Klan never will get a charter if these men get into office.
There were a lot of Kansans who wanted somebody that they could vote for or who wasn't, allied with this fascist organization, the Klans.
Charles H. McBrayer, Kansas Grand Dragon, urged Kansas Klansmen to stand firm and fight to the last breath and last drop of blood. White received 150,000 votes out of 600,000 cast. Paulin may have won, but White proved the Klan in Kansas was now a liability and not an asset.
His campaign was successful in that regard, in that it showed politicians that they didn't have to join the Klan. They didn't have to side with the Klan if they wanted to win lots of votes. It was possible to sort of short-circuit the Klan structure.
William Allen White, his constant drumbeat against the Klan in his campaign and then in his editorials was no doubt very influential in that.
Dr. Hiram Evans, the imperial wizard of the Kluxers, is bringing his consecrated shirt tail to Kansas this spring, and from gloomy Claverns will make 5 Kansas speeches. We welcome him. Enter the wizard. Sound the bull roars and the he-gaws. Beat the tom-toms. He will see what was once a thriving and profitable hate factory and bigotorium now laughed into a busted community where the cockeyed he-dragon wails for his firstborn and the nightshirts of a once salubrious pageantry sag in the spring breezes and bag at the wobbly knees. The Kluxers in Kansas are as dejected and sad as last year's bird's nest, afflicted with general debility, dizziness on going upstairs, and general aversion to female society.
When William Allen White ran the Klan out of Kansas, this is one of the great sort of achievements of his life, I think. And White said, no, this is a repugnant, loathsome, phenomenon, and we've got to fight it with everything we have, and he did, and he succeeded, and that's an enormous accomplishment.
You people have stayed away from me, many of you, until you are physical wrecks. You can never be made whole. The best we'll be able to do for many of you will be to patch you up.
Brinkley is fascinating. So this is this total quack doctor.
I guess it was the election of 1930, first of all. And the main thing, Dad was alive at that time, but the main thing I remember was Dr. Brinkley. John R. Brinkley, the great goat gland specialist.
His special operation was like the Viagra of its day. He claimed to cure male impotence by inserting goat testicles into humans, okay, surgically. And the American Medical Association was like, this guy's a quack. We need to shut him down. Now, this is very interesting. This is another relic of populism, and not just of populism with the capital P, but the populist sensibility.
It's a connection to White's anti-populism in the 1890s. It's the same idea. You've got the yahoos, the people who are just sort of attracted to the flashing lights and the loud music and that kind of stuff that Brinkley attracts. And so this is why White sees him as so threatening. It's like many a demagogue has gained power and been laughed at and been seen as a joke until they actually gain power. And then it's like, oh my God, this guy's in power and look what the horrible things he's doing.
He will appeal to the hillbilly mind as it has never been lured before. He is irresistible to the moron mind.
And I can remember my sisters and I going up to his headquarters, and they had some sheet music. And it was music, my sisters played it out on the piano and we would sing it. He's the man who's the man, he's the man who's the man.
He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley. He's the man who's the man. He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley.
And this doctor was flourishing in Kansas. He had a radio show. He was extremely popular. His radio show, he used to prescribe medicine over the air.
It's almost a household name. During the 1920s. And I think mostly because of his radio.
This man had a serious accident requiring the amputation of one of his legs. But he's up and going. And I'm wondering, what about you? How long are you going to keep going?
He is his own PR juggernaut. Creates a radio station in Kansas. It broadcasts to most of the country. He's able to lure people to Kansas for his goat gland surgery.
You just can't kill a Brinkley patient.
Eventually, of course, the goat glands don't work. The American Medical Association, the Kansas Board of Healing Arts, the Attorney General of Kansas, and William Allen White vow to drive him out of business.
They decided to shut this doctor down, and they were going to go on a campaign against him. And what's interesting about it was that these were the two voices of professionalism going after this guy who's a complete quack. Now, what is this doctor's response? It's to run for governor. That's how he's going to resist getting shut down. He's going to take it. He's going to be like Trump. He's going to take it to the next level. Okay, and here's what's really interesting. So when he runs for governor, what does he run as? Well, as a populist, and by the way, one of his issues was he was against the theory of evolution.
Brinkley gets into the race in 1930 when the country is just entering the Great Depression. People are starting to suffer. So there's an opportunity for charlatans or for opportunists like Brinkley to make an impact.
In Brinkley, he certainly saw someone who's like, you know, the fascists were using modern media to promote a very regressive, you know, view of the world.
I think he sees Brinkley as a political charlatan.
I've crossed the Rubicon. I'm not going to take my Brinkley licking lying down. I enclose an editorial. I'm going to shoot more of them. I think, as you say, we have to let this fellow get away with murder because we were afraid of offending his half-witted dupes. I just went into it hog wild and plumb loco, which I believe is my best technique. I had the same fun fighting Brinkley that I had fighting the Klan, and it was the same outfit, the organized moron minority. And we shot the old goat's guts full of holes, and there he lies today, belly up.
White used rhetoric that raised that issue about the moron majority. In other words, people who would vote for somebody more out of emotion than out of intellectual or reasoning.
In every age and clime, there is a great seething moronic underworld. Its denizens are literate. They can read and write, but they can't think. They live on the level of their emotions and vote their prejudices. Usually they are divided between the two great political parties, but occasionally some man or issue comes along that stirs them and they boil up and hold a Scopes trial in Tennessee or elect a Big Bill Thompson mayor of Chicago.
Brinkley voters flooded White with angry letters. They did not know what moronic meant, but they did know what underworld meant, and they were offended. Many corrected White, calling themselves good Christians. White responded.
Dear Brinkley voters, you got me wrong. I didn't mean that you were wicked. I only meant that you were dumb.
3 days before the election of governor in 1930, the Kansas Attorney General announced that the rules surrounding write-in candidates for governor had changed. To vote for Brinkley, it would have to specifically be written as J.R. Brinkley.
I think he has concerns that the average voter will be sucked in by this siren song, that they are susceptible to anybody who has a message that they want to hear at that moment. But clearly, William Allen White feared, in some ways, democracy, that people will vote for whatever sweet song that they hear coming from a politician. Certainly that was Doc Brinkley.
White was stunned to see Brinkley receive more than 180,000 votes, narrowly losing to Harry Woodring, who would later serve as Secretary of War under FDR. It is estimated that as many as 50,000 votes for Dr. Brinkley were not counted because of the Attorney General's new rule. Woodring later acknowledged that if the votes were counted, Brinkley would have won.
William Allen White, who was an avowed enemy of Doc Brinkley, continues to write editorials about him even after he has moved from Kansas to Texas, where he continues his goat gland surgery. But more importantly, he builds a behemoth radio station, 1 million watts. The strongest AM radio station now is 50,000 watts. People used to say that you could hear the radio station in the barbed wire through the fields near Del Rio, Texas.
So while pointing with pride to the fact that Kansas escaped the doctor's clutches, we view with alarm for the United States the danger which impends in Texas. If this republic ever totters to its fall, it will be because the moron minority shall sometime, somewhere, somehow, gain a party majority by unscrupulous leadership.
Had I read that in the newspaper, I would have immediately gone to the Trump campaign. It was prescient, I think, that William Allen White was warning us that if it's too good to be true, probably is.
Trump is, as I travel around the country talking about what has happened, it's like we're all Kansans now. I mean, this thing that I described out on the high plains, in Wichita back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, this is everywhere in America now. I go further than that. This is all over the world.
Doc Brinkley, he's prosecuted medical license is seized, dies penniless in Del Rio, Texas.
Kansas has this narrative about coming into the Union as a free state, and it's a noble narrative.
Kansas was the free state, founded by abolitionists, has a framework of laws that were actually far more progressive than some of our neighboring states, like Missouri, the slave state coming into the Union. So there's a background and a history. Women could vote in Kansas and own property in Kansas well before they could do it nationally.
Kansas was a lot like the states in the Deep South. Lots of rapes, lots of riots, a lot of racial purgings, lynchings, all those things happened, right? And yet there's still that noble narrative. The Free State, John Brown, the beginnings of the Civil War.
It is unfortunate for the new state of Oklahoma that she has classed herself with Mississippi and sundry other semi-barbarous southern states by the adoption of Jim Crow legislation, which denies Negroes the right to mingle with whites in hotels and on railway trains.
Back in the 20s, William Allen White was blacklisted by the Daughters of the American Revolution.
They blacklisted White, they blacklisted Clarence Darrow, they blacklisted the YMCA, I think. They blacklisted some Catholic organizations and some Jewish organizations. They were sort of charging that these people or these groups were un-American. And it is sort of difficult to pin down, okay, what exactly did they do that made them so angry, right? White pins it down for them.
The DAR has yanked the Klan out of the cow pasture and set it down in the breakfast room of respectability, removing its hood and putting on a transformation. Mrs. Broso is a lovely lady with many beautiful qualities of heart and mind, but in her enthusiasm, she has allowed several lengths of her Ku Klux nightie to show under her red, white, and blue.
The nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her Capitol debut at the Great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax.
Liberty is the only thing you can't have unless you give it to others.
The history of journalism in this country, I believe, is actually much more partisan than people recognize. You know, the idea of the modern objective journalist is a pretty recent thing. And so most small towns would have a Democratic paper and a Republican paper. You know, towns in Missouri would have a segregationist paper and an abolitionist paper. And so you kind of had to take a stand. As an editor, you had politics.
Journalism as a institution evolved in the same way, and much stronger sense of its role as a speaking truth to power.
Teddy Roosevelt is often credited with enticing white into the more progressive world. But I would argue that, in fact, the fact that William Allen White stayed in a small town, which is a very democratic place where everybody has to rub up against each other, and you know your neighbors, and you know the lowliest guy on the block, and you know the richest person, and you understand they're not really that different. And you may not understand that living in a big city in the way you do living in a small town.
When your world is awry and hope dead and vitality low and the appetite gone, there is no ocean trip, no month in the country, no known drug equal to the reviving quality of 24 hours spent on the front porch or in the sitting room of the White's house in Emporia.
I can remember going as a child over there, and he was in his hammock on the porch in a loose-fitting Panama-type suit with his leg over the side of the hammock swinging there. Their housekeeper was another fixture named Bertha Kohlgleiser. I should mention her. But she was also their cook, and was a fabulous cook. And I remember eating over there, and Mr. White did his thing, tossing the salad
So mix it up, the vinegar and oil with the lettuce,
Personally, White is the most unattractive man in Emporia, and that is saying much. You see him as he comes rolling down the street on his way to the Gazette office, and you wonder that he ever did anything but sit in the shade of a tree and drink lemonade. His clothes look as if they had been planned and cut out by the town tinner. His hat is the most impossible structure in the world. The face is the ordinary fat man's face and is usually covered with a short stubble of sandy beard and a sheepish smile. There is a half-suppressed twinkle in the eye that suggests an overgrown boy. Altogether, you would say that the man was made of putty, were it not for a certain firmness about the jaw, indicating that there is steel beneath this flabby exterior, and plenty of it, too.
The White's cabin in Estes Park, Colorado, became their private sanctuary. White would write and relax and recover from bouts of depression and from his hectic work and travel schedule.
Sally, in all of William Allen White's life, was in the background by choice.
His wife was a very strong personality, part of his life, but it never really, I think, seemed to occur to them that she would have her own career or her own life. They were a partnership, and she was his first and best editor. I would say William Allen White was a feminist for his day, but would not be considered today's feminism.
My advice to women is to raise more hell and fewer dahlias.
He was definitely a believer in women's suffrage.
Kansas should be the 6th state in the Union to do justice to women by giving them the right to vote. So long as women pay taxes, maintain homes, and rear young and help men to what small decency they have, women should have the right to vote. The men of Kansas are now given an opportunity to show their manhood by giving women a voice in the affairs wherein both men and women are vitally interested.
He supported women's careers. The test would have been, if his daughter had grown up and, graduated from college and wanted to do something, what might have happened there.
Henry Seidel Canby, his colleague from the Book of the Month Club, wrote of White, "One saw in him how a good molder of public opinion functions. He must have honesty himself. He must have modesty. He must have courage. He must have deep convictions. He must be willing to believe that his opponent is as human as himself." The country was debating whether to enter into World War II, but our allies in England and other countries were suffering attacks from Nazi Germany. Marshal Stimson approached White to chair the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. Stimson would state, "No other man in the country, I think, would have had the public confidence which would have enabled him to so quickly get together so large and responsible a body of the citizens."
There was a way in which William Allen White was not a journalist in the modern tradition, because he was basically an editorialist and a journalist at the same time, and he kind of wove those two things together. And that's something you could do at that time. But he also kind of understood that journalism had a public service that really started with reporting, that started with separating fact from mythology, fact from fiction, fact from hyperbole. And the positions he took were based on that.
The way William Allen White operated in his time, opinion journalism versus straight journalism, and the way they're operating now, say, in the Fox News, MSNBC mode. The old-fashioned journalism, there were 3 forms of it, all of them legit. There was straight news reporting, there was analysis reporting, analysis journalism, and then there was opinion journalism. And they were done by 3 different sets of people. And the reporters didn't give their analysis or give their opinions. The analysis people just did analysis, they didn't give their opinions. And the opinion people didn't do any reporting. I mean, in other words, it was all separated, and the readers understood these lines and what they meant. And William Allen White was one of those people who perpetrated that and followed that.
And so we're now in a period in which, in journalism, things seem to be going full circle. That attitude and kind of position taking those things are superseding actual facts, and that's a problem in journalism. And I think William Allen White helped usher in kind of a golden age of journalism in which responsible journalism became the norm. Irresponsible journalism was pushed to the margins. And I think we're at a point now where there's some danger of going back in the opposite direction, that responsible journalism is getting pushed to the side, and irresponsible journalism, or what passes as journalism, is becoming more dominant.
Because you don't like a story or because it presents you in a bad light, wow, it's fake news.
Fake news is something that seems to have come into sort of the parlance of the day. We used to call it lies, or we used to call it fabrications, because it's news that was made up for the purpose of either frightening people or getting them to respond in a certain way. It's not even news that's coming from any kind of legitimate news organization. I mean, we all make mistakes. We all make mistakes in our reporting, and we own them. But this is purposeful.
If I was a conservative viewer, I could see how some people would be really frustrated with the news. I think it's an overreaction to just say it's fake, and then to subscribe to news that really is fake and propaganda that is fulfilling to you, but not necessarily the truth.
Particularly in this last campaign, we started hearing about people who were primarily selling their ideas to advertisers and saying, if I write that Hillary Clinton is running, a child pornography ring in some pizza house in New York, people will click on that. So the term clickbait came into parlance as well. And advertisers then, because they see there's a certain number of eyeballs, would pay that person to write those stories. And they're not journalists. That's one aspect of fake news. Another is, basically what we would call propaganda.
Even if you know websites or news sites, it's very hard to tell because people do such a great job of faking it, including President Trump, who faked all these covers that he hangs in Mar-a-Lago. It's not that hard to do, and you can put all kinds of scurrilous things in there, or dangerous things, or just flat misleading. It's a very messy swamp to navigate for any consumer of news. And it's gotten so polarized that it's day or night news. You're either here or you're there. There's very little middle ground, and middle ground used to be the facts, just the facts. Well, we do not have the facts dished out to us regularly in any way anymore.
Good that's coming out of the Trump thing is that everybody's taking some deep breaths. Oh my God. The need for straight reporting is stronger now than it has been in a long time. And so there's more of it, and it makes some people mad, and some people can't tell the difference because they're now geared to, oh well, everybody's editorializing in news stories. Well, that's not true. It's not. But anyhow, some people think that, and if it's a negative story, it's got to be of an opinion story. No. It's maybe just the facts.
It has been my experience that most reporters that I've come in contact with probably do identify as left of center. What people don't tell you, though, is that our newspapers and our media is owned by about 6 companies, and they're run by conservatives.
This is a compilation courtesy of Deadspin that's gone viral this weekend. Just a little taste of what these promos look like.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
A lot of the kind of proto-fascist figures that arose in the 1930s, he kind of saw them all of a piece with these sort of demagogues and people who appealed to the lowest fears of the population.
I think today there are people who are very afraid, and maybe legitimately, of these incredible demographic changes that the country's undergoing. But what you don't get from White is the fear. You get the nobility of the heartland without the fear. And in that sense, it is noble, it is beautiful. But with the fear, it becomes something completely different.
And I think that was the other part of William Allen White's life that's important to recognize. He saw journalism as being central to the democratic experiment of America and followed through on that every day and actually made it real because he had an impact on that political life. And so I think it was possible. And I think he would say, keep your principles, stick to your principles, and have confidence they will win out in the end.
Life magazine said of White, he is the small-town boy who made good at home. To the small-town man who envies the glamour of the city, he is living assurance that small-town life may be preferable. To the city man who looks back with nostalgia on a small-town youth, he is the living symbol of small-town simplicity and kindness and common sense.
I still today feel like William Allen White represents that noble narrative that we haven't lived up to, but that we should continue to strive for.
I am not afraid of tomorrow, for I've seen yesterday and love today.
Well, I went to college in Washington, D.C. in 1966. It was an amazing time to be in that town.
You should be radical. You should demand change in the world. You should not accept the old order if the world is to move on.
During my 4 years in college, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and we had the Vietnam War marches. I was told as a student that it was impossible to bring down a sitting president, that, this would never work. You couldn't possibly stop a war. All of that sage advice was just dead wrong.
If our colleges and universities do not breed men who riot, who rebel, who attack life with all the youthful vim and vigor, then there is something wrong with our colleges.
Watching the Parkland students who were motivated by, again, a terrible tragedy, watching 17 of their classmates be mowed down by a gunman, but taking that tragedy and turning it into a movement that I think will, again, ignite a generation of younger people is one of the most optimistic things I have seen in a very long time.
The more riots that come on college campuses, the better world for tomorrow.
He used his power, if that's what it was, to advance the things he believed in, not to advance his own lot in life, his own station in life. He stayed in Emporia, Kansas, and was powerful from that point. And there's a lesson in that for all of us, I think.
I have never been bored an hour in my life. I get up every morning wondering what new, strange, glamorous thing is going to happen. And it always happens at fairly regular intervals. Lady Luck has been good to me, and I fancy she's been good to everyone, only some people are dour. And when she gives them the come hither with her eyes, they look down or turn away and lift an eyebrow. But me? I just give her a wink and away we go. Dip your pen in your arteries and write.
I think the thing that strikes me so much is that he really cared about what he was writing about. He had a passion and an optimism that I think would carry any journalist into a story and out the other side of it.
The facts, fairly and honestly presented, truth will take care of itself.
And I think the values of a William Allen White are important to remember if mainstream responsible journalism is going to keep its hold. I think it will, but it's under siege right now, and these kind of William Allen White values are important in holding that center ground.
My baggage for the short trip into posterity, which I may possibly take, will probably consist of one article less than 1,000 words. It would please Mary that she and I should go hand in hand together in our little visible journey before our road turned to oblivion.
Henry Seidel Canby in his memorial wrote, "There was a little Lincoln in William Allen White and a dash of Mark Twain, and some of the reasonableness of Thomas Jefferson when he was trying to persuade. And he could pounce like Theodore Roosevelt and be as eloquent when he spoke of Kansas as Thoreau in defense of the farmers of Concord. But most of all, he was his unique self, and is likely to become a symbol like these others for future generations."